Have you ever felt like your real story, the truth of who you are, wasn't destroyed, but locked away, not burned, not erased, but hidden, sealed behind wrong maps, wrong portraits, wrong names? We were told to look for ourselves in Rome, in Jerusalem, in the art of the Renaissance. But the doorway they pointed to was never the doorway to our past. Because in 2025, something happened that no historian in the West was expecting. A vault was opened, but not in London, not in Paris, not even in the museums of the United States. It was opened in Iran, and what came out was not gold, not ancient weapons, not some relic to be displayed behind glass. It was memory, pure, unfiltered memory. Inside the Iranian National Archives lay a collection of ancient Persian scrolls, royal records that had been quietly resting for over 2 millennia. Their fragile surfaces carried descriptions of a people once called Israel, but not the Israel that Renaissance paintings taught you to picture. These scrolls spoke of Israelites with skin the bronze of Nubia, hair tightly coiled like the kings of Kush, bloodlines stretching back to Ethiopia and the heartlands of Africa. This was not rumor. It was not rebellious theory. It was revelation, a story buried beneath empire, whitewashed by colonizers, rewritten in cathedral halls. And now, for the first time, it was being unsealed. If you've ever felt something stir deep inside you when hearing the name Yahweh, if you've ever wondered why the Bible's stories feel both strangely familiar and strangely distant, if you've ever questioned why your ancestors were stripped of their names, their language, even their Sabbath, then you're already standing at the edge of this truth. This isn't just a history lesson. It's the return of the first memory, and it begins in the one place the Western world never thought to search: ancient Iran. In the next few minutes, I'll show you the scroll that altered the entire picture of biblical history. It's a record that describes the Israelites in terms that no Western museum dares to display. What it says will shatter the neat boundaries of race, faith, and divine identity. They say history is written by the victors. But what happens when history is written by someone who wasn't trying to win, only to remember? In 2025, the Iranian archives quietly declassified a cache of ancient documents. There were no press conferences, no front-page headlines, no international exhibitions. But for those who read carefully, they whispered a story the West was never meant to hear. These weren't mythical tales. They were royal records, census scrolls, temple decrees dating back to the reign of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who conquered Babylon and allowed the Israelites to return to their homeland. And in those records, the Israelites did not look like the pale, narrow-faced figures we've seen for centuries in European stained glass. They were described with the bronze skin of Nubia and the coiled hair of Kushite kings. They weren't just a people in exile, they were related to the Kushites, the Sabians, and the Ethiopians. Suddenly, the centuries of silence made sense. The Bible itself speaks often of Cush, the son of Ham, whose descendants settled in regions we now call Sudan, Ethiopia, and southern Egypt. Throughout the Old Testament, Kushites are not depicted as outsiders. They appear as warriors, scribes, prophets, even protectors of God's people. Now here's where the scrolls turn the story upside down. A Persian military register, dated to 538 BCE, less than a year after Babylon's fall, lists skilled artisans and priests being resettled. Among them sons of the house of Israel, described as dark of face, with hair tightly wound, speaking a tongue akin to the people of Punt and Saba. That's not a portrait of Europe. That's a portrait of East Africa, even more revealing. A temple decree from King Darius, preserved in fragments from Susa, refers to a covenant people exiled from the lands of Cush and brought north by force. If the Israelites weren't only exiled from Babylon, but also had deep roots in the kingdoms of Cush and Saba, then the origin story we've been given is, at best, incomplete, and at worst, deliberately altered. You might ask, how could something this big be ignored for so long? The truth is uncomfortable. When Western scholars began translating ancient texts in the 18th and 19th centuries, they weren't neutral. Many were funded by empires that built their wealth on the transatlantic slave trade, on colonizing Africa, on spreading the belief that black skin signified savagery instead of sacredness. So when Persian records described Israelites in African terms, those passages were buried in footnotes, dismissed as irrelevant, or never translated for public eyes. And yet, one truth they could not erase was already in our Bibles, Isaiah 45:1. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held. In Hebrew, the word for anointed is Messiah. Why would God call a pagan king Messiah? Unless this king's purpose was to protect the true insiders, a people scattered and conquered, described by Persian scribes as dark-skinned, curly-haired children of the covenant. Another fragment from the Persian city of Persepolis speaks of the singers of Yahweh, whose chants echoed the melodies of Cushite mothers. The scribes noted that these Israelites mourned in the language of the south, yet worshipped in the name of the northern sky. This was not random poetry, it was theology. It was history, pointing to an African memory at the root of Israel's story. Imagine being a Persian scribe centuries before Jesus, watching this exiled people rebuild their life. You note their customs, their music, their language. You don't draw them as pale-robed pilgrims from Europe. You describe them as Africans bearing a fire of faith that no exile could extinguish. And now the question becomes unavoidable. If the Israelites who returned to Jerusalem were dark-skinned descendants of Cush, if Persian kings called them chosen, if the Bible itself calls Cyrus a Messiah for aiding them, then why are we still teaching children to picture them with pale skin and blue eyes? The answer is not just academic. It is political. It is spiritual. Because if the Israelites were black, then the entire visual language of redemption shifts. Holiness no longer looks like the court of a European king. It looks like you. It looks like your grandfather. It looks like a forgotten people, remembered in Persia and erased by empire. And this is only the first crack in the wall, because in the next part, we'll explore exactly how step by step the face of the Bible was systematically repainted through Renaissance art, colonial theology, and church doctrine, until the original people of the covenant became unrecognizable. If ancient Persia remembered the Israelites as black, how did the world forget? How did the children of Cush, the sons of Jacob, once described with bronze skin and coiled hair, become pale, golden-haired figures in our paintings and films? How did the image of holiness shift so far from the truth that it became almost unrecognizable? The answer begins in paint and ends in power. By the 1400s, Christianity in Europe had evolved from a faith into an empire's tool. It was no longer simply about remembering God's people. It was about controlling how God himself would be seen. Kings, popes, and empires understood something crucial. If you can control the image of God, you can control the authority of those who claim to represent him. And so, the artists got to work. Look at Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. It's not a scene from ancient Judea. The table, the clothing, the faces all belong to Renaissance Italy. Jesus and his disciples are pale-skinned, narrow-faced, clean-shaven men. No trace of desert sun on their cheeks, no hint of the Middle East, and certainly no echoes of Cush, Ethiopia, or Nubia in their features. It's a dinner party in Florence, disguised as a biblical moment. But if you go back centuries earlier, you'll see a completely different picture. In the oldest Christian churches of Ethiopia, Jesus is painted with deep brown skin, tightly coiled hair, and eyes that mirror the people around him. The apostles are shown as sons of Africa, not citizens of Rome. Even early Coptic art from Egypt shows Mary and the baby Jesus as dark-skinned. In the catacomb paintings of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Messiah's features are more African or Semitic than anything resembling the later European ideal. So, what changed? The turning point came with Constantine. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, faith began to serve a new master imperial politics. The image of God began to bend toward the image of the emperor. Over the centuries, as the empire's influence shifted north and west, so too did the visual language of holiness. God, they decided, should look like us. But us didn't mean the ancient Israelites. It meant the rulers of Western Europe. This wasn't just an artistic choice. It was strategy. If the image of holiness could be whitewashed, so could the story of who God favored. If Jesus could look like Caesar, then Caesar could claim divine right. And in time, being chosen began to mean looking European. The colonial era only magnified this. As European nations expanded their reach across Africa, the Americas, and Asia, they needed a moral justification for conquest and enslavement. Enter the new imagery. Missionaries carried Bibles illustrated with blonde-haired, blue-eyed messiahs. Moses was white. The prophets wore European robes. The message was clear. Salvation looked like the colonizer. And the damage went deeper than most realize. Take Moses, for example. The Bible tells us that he was raised in Pharaoh's household, and when he fled to Midian, the locals mistook him for an Egyptian. Exodus 2:19. They didn't hear his voice before deciding this, they saw his face. And the Egyptians of that time look at their own art: dark skin, coiled hair, broad noses, features unmistakably African. If Moses could pass as Egyptian, then he likely shared their appearance. And yet, in every major Hollywood film, Moses is played by a white actor: Charlton Heston, Christian Bale, Liam Neeson. Why? Because to depict Moses as black would dismantle centuries of constructed supremacy. The same distortion is applied to Jesus. The Bible doesn't give a full portrait, but Revelation 1:14-15 says, "His hair was like wool, and his feet like bronze burned in a furnace." Hair like wool, skin like burned bronze. That's not a Scandinavian description. And yet in paintings across Europe, Jesus is rendered with smooth skin, golden hair, and pale eyes, the opposite of the text. Why the contradiction? because image is power, and whiteness had to be sanctified in the eyes of empire. Here's a detail that rarely surfaces in public discussions: the first statue of Jesus ever carved in Europe, dating back to the 3rd century AD, was not white. Archaeologists unearthed it from early Christian graves in southern Italy. It depicts a man with tightly curled afro-textured hair and a broad Afro-Asiatic face wrapped in a simple robe. For nearly 1,000 years, this was closer to the accepted image of Christ. Only in the High Middle Ages did the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus become the unchallenged standard, and so the visual transformation was complete. But this wasn't just about changing how God looked. It was about rewriting identity itself. If God was white, then his chosen people would be imagined as white, which meant that anyone who didn't fit that image, anyone with skin like bronze, with hair like wool, with the features of Cush or Ethiopia, could be pushed to the margins of the story. The result: a world that forgot the sound of Hebrew songs in African deserts, the wisdom of Ethiopia, the prophecy of Nubia, the bloodlines of Sheba. In their place, the world inherited a counterfeit gospel, one that uplifted empire and buried the original people of the covenant. But if the image was changed to hide the truth, it can be restored to reveal it. And restoring that image isn't an act of rebellion, it's an act of redemption. Because while the West was repainting the faces of prophets and kings, Persia's records still told the truth. Scrolls still spoke of a covenant people with dark skin, sacred names, and echoes of Cushite royalty. And the overlap between ancient Hebrew faith and African spiritual traditions didn't vanish. It endured quietly, in rituals and languages that empire never fully erased. And that's exactly what we'll uncover next: the strange and powerful web that connects ancient Jewish theology to African spiritual memory. It's not theory, it's not speculation. It's in the languages, the ceremonies, and the symbols that still live today. When you ask most Western scholars a simple question, "What language did Abraham speak?" the answer usually comes quickly: Hebrew. But that's only part of the truth, because Hebrew does not stand alone. It is one thread in a much older, much wider tapestry, a tapestry that stretches across continents, binding Africa and Asia in ways the modern world has quietly ignored. This linguistic family has a name: Afro-Asiatic. Say it slowly: Afro-Africa. Asiatic Asia. One language family, two continents, united long before Europe ever entered the story. Hebrew, the language of prophets and kings, belongs here alongside Amharic in Ethiopia, Hausa across West Africa, Arabic in North Africa and the Middle East, Oromo, Somali, Berber, and more. This isn't academic trivia. This is a map of memory. It tells us that the people who spoke to God in Hebrew were not far removed from the people who sang in Amharic, prayed in Hausa, or told proverbs in Yoruba. They were cousins in speech, sharing the same roots in both sound and thought. Consider this: in Hebrew, the word for life is chime. In Amharic, it's haywet. In Hausa, rayuwa. In Arabic, hayat. Different tongues, same heartbeat. The structure, the rhythm, the worldview all trace back to a shared ancestral logic. And that logic comes not from Europe, but from the intertwined lands of Africa and Asia. But language is only one layer of this web. Symbols, rituals, and sacred patterns reveal even more. Take the Ark of the Covenant, a gold-covered chest carried on poles, holding the tablets given to Moses. Now, look to Ethiopia. In every Orthodox Ethiopian church, there is a tabot, a sacred replica of the Ark veiled, honored, untouchable by bare hands. On holy days, priests carry it wrapped in embroidered cloth, accompanied by drums, singing, and dancing. The resemblance to ancient Israelite worship is not coincidence. It's continuity. Or examine the garments of Israel's ancient priests, the ephod, the breastplate set with 12 stones, the robes of linen, the bells and pomegranates at the hem. Now compare them to the ceremonial dress of Yoruba and Igbo spiritual leaders, or the regalia of West African high priests. The parallels are striking. Even the symbolism of 12 appears, echoing the 12 tribes of Israel. This is why the Afro-Asiatic web is not just a linguistic tree, it's spiritual DNA. It proves that the God of Israel, Yahweh, was not a stranger to Africa, brought in by missionaries or conquerors. He was remembered by communities whose ancestors once carried his covenant. Here's where the evidence turns uncomfortable for the Western narrative. For centuries, the Church taught a north-to-south gospel as if Europe received the truth and generously carried it into a dark, empty Africa. But the deeper we dig, the more the map reverses. The flow of faith didn't start in Rome and travel south. It moved from ancient Israel down through Kush into Ethiopia, centuries before European Christianity existed. The Beta Israel of Gondar in Ethiopia. Jewish communities who kept the Torah, observed the Sabbath, circumcised their sons, and maintained kosher laws weren't following instructions from European rabbis. They were living out traditions passed down for over 2,000 years without interruption, not conversion inheritance. And then comes the fragment from the Royal Persian archives, a jewel of historical testimony. One court scholar of King Darius wrote, "The priests of the house of Yahweh wear skins of spotted leopards and dance as the Cushites do when calling the storm. They beat drums not with violence, but with rhythm, and their prayers are like the winds of the southern lands." Pause and picture that. The priests of Yahweh, not pale. Solemn figures standing stiff in marble halls, but dancers in leopard skins, moving in rhythm, their worship alive with the music of Cush. This isn't chaos. It's ancient theology in motion. Compare that to the frozen pews of many modern churches. Somewhere along the way, the fire was traded for frost. The song of the South was replaced by the silence of the North. The living rhythm of covenant worship was painted over by stone-faced portraits in European chapels. But here's the truth, that fire didn't die. It migrated. It pulsed in the drums of West Africa. It moved in the feet of Zionist dancers in Ethiopia. It breathed through the call and response chants of enslaved Africans in the Americas, people who had never read a Bible, but instinctively knew the rhythm of deliverance. That's not cultural borrowing. That's ancestral memory. And if this is true, if Africa wasn't a footnote in the biblical story, but one of its foundations, then every cry of Yahweh in African tongues today is not an act of conversion. It is an act of remembrance. And this conversation is far from over. Because in the next part of our journey, we won't rely on Persian scribes or linguistic evidence. We'll let the Bible itself speak directly, openly about blackness, not as metaphor, not as poetic flourish, but as plain description. And once you hear it, you won't be able to unread it. The silence you've grown up with wasn't always there. Before Europe's paintbrush erased the faces of the chosen, the Bible spoke plainly about who they were and what they looked like. But somewhere along the way, we were taught to filter those words to call skin color a metaphor, to make blackness into a symbol instead of a reality. But what if it never was metaphor? What if the prophets, kings, and saints were not speaking in riddles, but giving us a truth that empire later concealed? Let's begin with Solomon, the son of David, builder of the temple, the wisest king of Israel. In the Song of Solomon 1:5 he declares, "I am black and beautiful, O daughters of Jerusalem. Not I am dark yet lovely," as some translations soften it. The original Hebrew is Shakora Ani Vanava. I am black and beautiful. There is no but in that sentence. There is no apology. Solomon is not excusing his color, he is celebrating it. This is the voice of Israel's most glorious ruler, a king in the direct bloodline of Jesus, openly proclaiming his blackness. So how did we move from a black king building Yahweh's temple to European paintings of a pale Messiah surrounded by pale apostles? Part of the answer lies in selective vision. Consider Moses. Exodus 2 tells us that after fleeing Egypt, Moses arrives in Midian. The daughters of Jethro say, "An Egyptian delivered us from the shepherds." They didn't hear his accent before saying that they saw him. He looked Egyptian. And what did Egyptians look like in Moses' day? We don't have to guess. Look at the tomb paintings of Thebes, the temples of Karnak, the murals of Nubian pharaohs. They depict people with deep brown or black skin, coiled hair, broad noses, features you would recognize today as African. Even the Egyptian historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BCE, described the Hebrews as a people kin to the Ethiopians. If Moses could pass for an Egyptian, and Egyptians were black, then Moses himself could not have been the pale figure in Hollywood films. The same pattern appears with Joseph, sold into slavery in Egypt. Joseph rose to become Pharaoh's right hand. His own brothers stood before him during the famine and didn't recognize him, not because he was in disguise, but because he looked so thoroughly Egyptian that the thought he might be their kin never crossed their minds. And then there is the New Testament. Acts 21:38 records a Roman commander mistaking Paul for that Egyptian who led a revolt. Again, the connection is visual. Israelites looked so much like Africans that even Romans confused them for one another. If Moses could be mistaken for an Egyptian, if Joseph could be hidden in plain sight, if Paul could be assumed to be an African revolutionary, and if Solomon openly declared, "I am black and beautiful," then we have to face what these accounts are telling us: early Hebrews were visibly African. But this is where the truth met resistance. If skin color didn't matter, why was it erased? Why were black features systematically removed from icons, from children's Bibles, from church art? Jeremiah, in Lamentations 5:10, writes, "Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine." Some interpret this as a change caused by suffering, but others, including early Jewish commentators, saw it as poetic confirmation of a naturally dark-skinned people whose hardship deepened their appearance. Either way, the verse affirms their blackness, not as metaphor, but as physical reality. And remember, the Bible does not erase this. We did. This matters because lies about identity are not harmless. A lie told long enough becomes a worldview, even a religion. The lie that God's people were always white has justified centuries of exclusion, oppression, and spiritual disconnection. So now, the choice is ours. Keep reading the Bible through the lens of empire, or read it as it is, with no filters. Because if we read it as it is, we see something extraordinary, a chain of black prophets, kings, and apostles whose identity didn't vanish when the exile ended. It traveled, it crossed deserts, it sailed oceans, and it survived in the songs and rituals of African tribes who never forgot the name Yahweh. And that's exactly where we go next, to trace the echoes of Sinai from Ethiopia to Nigeria to Ghana. Because what we're about to see will show that the Old Testament didn't just end in Africa, it kept living there. The Hebrews were never truly lost. They were scattered, carried far from the land of their fathers, but the covenant didn't vanish with the exile. It moved. It hid itself in the body, in the mind, in the everyday rituals of life. And while empires rewrote the scrolls and painted over the faces, Africa remembered not in libraries or lecture halls, but in blood and breath. History doesn't always survive in monuments. Sometimes it survives in what people do without even knowing why. A name whispered during childbirth, a law kept out of instinct, a holy day observed even in chains. This is not cultural coincidence. This is religious continuity. Let's begin in West Africa, among the Igbo people of Nigeria. For generations, anthropologists have been puzzled by their ancient customs. They circumcise their sons on the 8th day. They observe a Sabbath day of rest. They distinguish between clean and unclean foods. They offer animal sacrifices in precise ways that mirror the Torah. They follow a lunar calendar with feast days that align closely with the ancient Hebrew festivals. These aren't the fingerprints of European missionaries in many cases. These practices existed long before any contact with Western Christianity. The Igbo call God Chukwu or Chi, the Great Spirit or the Supreme One, and their word, Chineke, God, the Creator, carries a resonance shockingly close to Hebrew titles for God like Elyon, the Most High. Is this coincidence, perhaps? But when you place it alongside their laws, their calendar, their sacrificial customs, it begins to sound less like chance and more like memory. Now travel southeast to Ethiopia, home of the Beta Israel, the House of Israel, also known as the Falasha Jews. Long before the world ever heard the term Zionism, these communities were already preserving the Torah. They practiced circumcision, kept kosher dietary laws, recited Hebrew prayers, and wore fringes on their garments, exactly as commanded in Numbers 15. They didn't do these things because a missionary handed them a Bible. They did them because they were already living the covenant. Beta Israel claimed descent from the tribe of Dan. Whether or not one accepts that lineage, The fact remains they kept these laws in isolation for over 2,000 years, without Talmudic rabbis, without European synagogues carrying the covenant purely through oral tradition and lived obedience. Now turn west again, to the Yoruba people of Nigeria. Outsiders often label Yoruba religion as pagan, but beneath its complex system of orishas and spiritual intercessors lies something familiar, a belief in a single supreme creator, reverence for a seventh-day rest, sacred use of oil and incense, covenant rituals between heaven and earth. Even their naming traditions carry echoes of Hebrew consciousness names meaning God has answered, born into blessing, he who walks with the Holy One. These aren't random poetic flourishes. They are reminders, living threads of an older covenantal worldview. And here is where the story sharpens into something astonishing. In the 1970s, a group of Igbo elders were asked why they still kept these ancient customs. Their answer was simple: because we are children of Eri, and Eri came from the east. He taught us the ways of the covenant. Eri. If you open 1 Chronicles 7:25, you'll see that name, Eri, son of Gad, son of Jacob, a grandson of Israel. Are we saying Eri literally journeyed from Canaan to West Africa? We cannot prove it beyond all doubt. But the Igbo oral tradition remembers a great ancestor who came from the east, led them to new lands, and taught them the ways of the Most High. The story mirrors the Exodus itself, a migration, a covenant, a name preserved for thousands of years. Now, here's the part that cuts deep. Many of these tribes, Igbo, Yoruba, Beta Israel, Lemba, were prime targets during the transatlantic slave trade. The very people who carried these ancient traditions were the ones kidnapped, stripped of their names, sold into bondage. Why? Because a people who still carried the covenant, even in fractured form, were dangerous to empires built on domination. And this is why the Bible's prophecy in Deuteronomy 28 feels so haunting. You will be scattered among the nations. Your sons and daughters will be given to another people. You will long for them all day long, but your hands will be powerless. If you think this is just anthropology, think again. This is prophecy. The Torah didn't just describe exile, it foresaw the ships, the scattering, the breaking of memory. But prophecy also points to return. The same God who warned of scattering also promised to gather his people again. And that's where we must go next, into one of the most chilling and specific prophecies in all of Scripture. A prophecy that may have spoken of the slave ships of the Atlantic thousands of years before they ever set sail. Some prophecies are poetic, others are symbolic, but some are so precise that they strike like a direct arrow through history. In Deuteronomy 28:68, Moses delivers a chilling warning to the children of Israel: "And the Lord shall bring you into Egypt again with ships. By the way whereof I said unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you." Pause and let those words sink in. Egypt in the Bible often means more than just a place on a map. It is a symbol of slavery, oppression, and bondage. Israel had already been delivered from Egypt once, and they walked out on foot, led by God himself. So to say they would return to Egypt by ships is to describe a reversal so complete that it would undo the very image of freedom. Sold to your enemies, no man shall redeem you. This is not poetic suffering. This is a logistical prophecy, a blueprint for captivity, and for centuries. No one knew how literally to take it until it happened. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, the nightmare unfolded. Millions of African men, women, and children were torn from their homes, bound in chains, and forced onto ships, wooden hulls so cramped and filthy that many never survived the voyage. They were sold in foreign lands, renamed, stripped of their languages, their culture, their faith. The world called it commerce. The Bible had called it a curse. The rest of Deuteronomy 28 reads like a ledger of the transatlantic slave trade. You will be scattered among the nations. Your sons and daughters will be given to another people. You will become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations. Deut. 28, 32, 37. If you are descended from the transatlantic slave trade, does this sound familiar? And here is the detail: many historians avoid. The majority of those taken in the slave trade came from West African regions, home to tribes like the Igbo, Yoruba, Ashanti, and Iwa. And as we've already seen, many of these peoples practiced Hebraic customs long before European missionaries ever set foot there. They were circumcising their sons, observing Sabbath, honoring the Most High by a name their ancestors had carried for centuries. They were not random captives. They were covenant people, uprooted and scattered, just as the Torah warned. But the curse was not arbitrary. It was covenantal. Moses had told Israel that if they turned away from Yahweh and broke his commands, these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. This was not a random tragedy. It was the penalty of a broken agreement, a holy contract written in blood at Sinai. Yet here's the thread of hope that runs through even the darkest prophecy. God's punishments are never the last word. What Pharaoh intended for bondage, God has often used for awakening. And in recent decades, something has begun to stir. Across America, the Caribbean, Brazil, and Europe, descendants of the enslaved are starting to ask dangerous questions. Why were we the only people whose entire identity was erased? Why do we feel drawn to the Old Testament, even when no one taught us to be? Why do words like Yahweh, Sabbath, and Zion feel so strangely familiar? And most urgently, could we be Israel? This is not rebellion, it is remembrance. People are opening the Bible again, not to escape history, but to reclaim it. They are reading Deuteronomy and realizing it is not just an ancient warning, it is a mirror, a map, a spiritual DNA test. Consider the work of author and theologian Rudolf Windsor, who in 1967 published From Babylon to Timbuktu, using historical records and archaeology. He traced how Hebrew tribes fled Roman persecution in 70 AD, migrating south and west into Africa, into the very regions that later became the center of the slave trade. His conclusion: the same Israelites who escaped Roman swords eventually fell into the nets of European slave traders. Now read Deuteronomy 28:68. Again, Egypt, slavery. Ships, the method. Sold, the market. No man shall buy you, no one would redeem you from that condition. This isn't vague prophecy. It's the transatlantic slave trade written centuries before its time. And yet, in the same book, God makes a promise. In Deuteronomy 30:4, he says, "If any of thine be driven out unto the outmost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. The same God who scattered will gather. The same covenant that brought the curse will bring restoration." And this is why the awakening we see now, the return to Hebrew names, the keeping of Sabbath, the rejection of idolatry. The rediscovery of lost identity is not a fad, it is prophecy unfolding. But to truly grasp how deep the restoration runs, we have to go to one of the few places on earth where the Bible survived untouched by European revision, high in the mountains of Ethiopia, in the hands of priests who never forgot who they were. By now, we've uncovered prophecy fulfilled, rituals preserved, and identities rising from the ashes of empire. But what if I told you there's even more, that entire books of the Bible have been hidden from the world? Not because they were false, but because they were too true. Not because they contradicted Scripture, but because they confirmed it too clearly. And here's the twist. Those books weren't safeguarded in Europe. They were preserved in Africa, in one of the oldest and most unbroken Christian traditions on earth, high in the mountains of Ethiopia. This is the Ethiopian Bible, the Ge'ez canon. And unlike the Western canon of 66 books, it contains 88. Long before the Catholic Church decided what would be considered official scripture, long before Martin Luther removed books from the Old Testament, long before King James commissioned an English version for political unity, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church had already been guarding a wider, richer canon, one that told a story connecting Israel directly to Africa. So what's inside this canon? There is the Book of Enoch, a revelation given to Noah's great-grandfather filled with visions of heavenly realms, fallen angels, and prophecies about the coming Messiah. The Book of Jubilees, a detailed retelling of Genesis and Exodus that preserves ancestral timelines and a divine calendar, the very rhythms of time that Western Christianity quietly set aside. First and Second Maccabean, not the Catholic Maccabees, but unique Ethiopian accounts of Israelite struggle and resilience. Absent from Western Bibles, the Book of Tobit, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Baruch, and others texts that appeared in early Christian Bibles but were slowly erased in Protestant traditions. These weren't myths. They were considered sacred scripture for centuries, and Ethiopia never let them go. Why does this matter? Because inside these books are details that the West has never wanted to confront. For example, Enoch 46 gives a vision of the coming Messiah, and there I saw one who had a head of days, and with him was another whose face had the appearance of a man, and his face was full of grace, and his hair was like wool, and his skin like bronze burned in a furnace. Sound familiar? It mirrors Revelation 1:14-15. Almost word for word. His hair was white like wool, his feet like fine brass, as if burned in a furnace, hair like wool, skin like bronze, not blonde, not porcelain, not European. The Ethiopian Bible never erased these descriptions, but in Western Christian art, they were painted over. They had to be, because if Jesus looked like that, the entire image of divinity, power and chosenness would shift. So why were these books removed from the Western canon? The official explanations vary. Lack of apostolic authorship, too mystical, theological confusion. But let's be honest, they weren't removed because they were wrong. They were removed because they were too right, too clear about the identity of God's people, too bold in describing the Messiah, too aligned with Africa's role in the divine story. When European empires began reshaping Christianity, they didn't just choose which scriptures to keep. They curated an image of God, of salvation, of holiness. And any book that reminded people that the covenant was rooted in African truth was quietly set aside. Meanwhile, in Ethiopia, those books were kept safe, guarded in stone churches carved into mountain rock, written in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language with deep ties to Hebrew, hand-copied by priests who understood that some truths can't be left in the hands of empire. Ethiopian tradition even holds this legend. When Rome burned Jerusalem, we did not forget. When they rewrote the scrolls, we rewrote the memories. When they painted Christ pale, we painted him as he was. And this isn't just folklore. Archaeologists have found illuminated Ethiopian manuscripts centuries old with Mary cradling a black Messiah, prophets with curly hair and copper-toned skin, angels with African features and fire in their eyes. These weren't political statements, they were faithful depictions. The 88 books of the Ethiopian canon are not just more pages, they are a fuller story with timelines, genealogies, visions, and covenants that place Africa not at the edges, but at the center. They show a Messiah who didn't look like Caesar, and a God who didn't begin in Rome. They echo with the voices of those the world called slaves, but whom Scripture calls chosen. So what does this mean for you? It means the story isn't locked away in seminaries or Vatican vaults. It's alive, preserved by a people the world tried to erase. The books the West deleted are the very books Africa kept safe because Africa remembered. And now, so do you. But our journey doesn't stop here. We're going back even further before Moses, before Sinai, into the deserts where Yahweh's name was already being called by peoples who never held a scroll, yet knew him anyway. Because Israel didn't invent Yahweh, they met him. Before Moses stood barefoot on holy ground, before Israel marched through the Red Sea, before the 10 Commandments thundered down from Mount Sinai, God was already known, not just by the Hebrews, not just by the descendants of Abraham, but by wanderers, nomads, and ancient desert peoples, some of them African. The name Yahweh did not suddenly appear on Sinai. It was already echoing across mountain ranges and desert winds long before Israel entered the covenant. We catch a glimpse of this in Genesis 14. Abraham, still called Abram, returns from battle and is met by a mysterious figure, Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of El Elyon, the Most High God. Melchizedek blesses Abram, offers him bread and wine, and Abram gives him 1/10 of all he has. Here's what matters. Melchizedek was not a Hebrew. He was not from the line of Shem. He had no part in the covenant of circumcision, yet the Bible calls him a priest of the Most High God. The New Testament letter to the Hebrews says Melchizedek was without father, without mother, without genealogy, a priestly type of the Messiah himself, which forces the question, how could a non-Hebrew be a true priest of Yahweh, unless Yahweh was already worshipped outside Israel's bloodline? The pattern continues in Deuteronomy 33:2. The Lord came from Sinai, and dawned upon them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran, and came with 10,000s of holy ones. Seir is in Edom. Mount Paran lies deep in the wilderness, likely in the Arabian Peninsula lands bordering modern-day Sudan, Ethiopia, and southern Egypt. In other words, the Bible itself says Yahweh's presence came from the desert, from the south, from the regions long tied to Cush. And then there's one of the most overlooked truths in the Torah. Before Moses even knew the name Yahweh, his father-in-law Jethro already worshipped him. In Exodus 18, Jethro, a priest of Midian, blesses Yahweh, offers sacrifices, and teaches Moses how to lead the people. This is before the 10 Commandments, before the covenant at Sinai. The implication is staggering. Moses learned leadership and worship from a man whose people already knew Yahweh. So who were the Midianites, desert dwellers, kin to Israel through Abraham's second wife, Keturah? Their lands stretched into Arabia and northeastern Africa. Their worship was organized, priestly, and reverent. Yahweh's name had already found a home among them before Moses' call. Persian records preserve an even older memory. Among writings kept by Zoroastrian priests is a startling line, "The God of Abraham, called Yahu, is not a new God, but the old one remembered by Cushites and sons of the south." Stop and let that echo. Cushites, Nubians. Ethiopians remembered Yahweh long before Israel carved his name into stone tablets. Egyptian inscriptions predating Moses mention a deity called Yiv or Yu, associated with desert tribes, lightning, and mountain worship. Many scholars see this as an early form of Yahweh's name, and this changes everything, because if Yahweh was already known to Cushites, Midianites, and other desert peoples, then the covenant with Israel was not the birth of God's story. It was the deepening of a relationship that had already begun. Abraham didn't invent Yahweh. He entered into covenant with a God who had been moving across nations for generations. This truth unsettles empire. If God was only revealed to Israel, then power stays centralized. But if Yahweh was known by black nations, desert tribes, and mountain dwellers before Israel, then access to him is far broader than empire ever admitted. Even the prophet Isaiah saw this. In Isaiah 19:25, God says, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance." Egypt, often seen as the symbol of slavery, is here called my people. This is not exclusion. This is ancient inclusion, a reminder of the days when Melchizedek served bread and wine, when Cushite priests danced in Yahweh's name, when his voice thundered from southern mountains long before Sinai. So what does this mean for us now? It means that the God of Israel was not hidden in one corner of Canaan. He walked in the deserts of Africa. He whispered to Cush. He was already enthroned in the praises of black saints long before the first Hebrew scroll was written. And that brings us to the next unavoidable question. If Yahweh was worshipped by Cush, if the Messiah looked like bronze, if the priests danced like Midianites, then what had to be rewritten to make Europe the center of the story? That's what we face in the next part, the moment when African divinity was systematically erased from the record, and the face of God was repainted. Power doesn't always arrive with swords or armies. Sometimes it comes quietly with paint and a brush. The most dangerous way to control a people is not by telling them what to believe, but by showing them who they should believe in, and then changing the face of that God. For thousands of years, divinity had many faces, and most of them were dark. In ancient Egypt, the goddess Isis was carved and painted with deep brown skin, tightly coiled hair, nursing her son Horus, a mother and child image that would later be mirrored in Christian art of Mary and Jesus. In India, Krishna's very name means dark, and he was celebrated as beautiful with blue-black skin. Among the Yoruba of West Africa, the Orishas were depicted in the colors of the earth: brown, gold, obsidian, their forms carrying the dignity and power of African features. Even in early Europe, before the whitening of faith, the Black Madonna was venerated in cathedrals from France to Poland to Spain, a dark-skinned Virgin Mary cradling a dark-skinned Christ. There are still more than 400 surviving images of her today, hidden away in mountain chapels and side altars. But then, something happened. When Europe rose to global power, it didn't just conquer land, it conquered the imagination. It replaced the face of God. Look at what happened to the Black Madonna. In places like Montserrat in Spain, pilgrims still travel to touch her hand, her skin unmistakably dark, her features African. In Unsealed, Switzerland, she was once the central icon of the altar. But as the centuries passed, new paintings and statues began to emerge: pale Mary, pale child, delicate features, golden hair. And when the old statues were questioned, the answer given was almost laughable. It's candle smoke. But candle smoke does not change the shape of noses. It does not curl hair or alter cultural features. That wasn't carbon. That was colonialism. The same fate met Jesus. Scripture and the Ethiopian Bible describe him with hair like wool and skin like bronze burned in a furnace. Yet nearly every European painting from the Renaissance onward shows him as a slender, pale-skinned man with straight golden hair. That wasn't an innocent artistic choice. It was branding. A Christ who looked like Caesar could serve Caesar's purposes. A black Messiah, however, might remind the enslaved and colonized of who they truly are, and empires couldn't afford that. Once you control the face of God, you control the mirror people use to see themselves. If divinity is white, then whiteness becomes divinity. And if holiness has blue eyes, everything else is seen as lesser. And here's the dangerous follow-up. If you can make the Messiah look European, you can also make his chosen people look European, which means Africa's role in the covenant could be erased not with a sword, but with a brush. This transformation wasn't random. In the 15th century, just before the transatlantic slave trade began, a wave of Christian art swept across Europe: paintings, stained glass, sculptures all depicting Jesus, Mary, the apostles, and prophets as white Europeans. At the same time, papal edicts like the Doctrine of Discovery gave European nations the divine right to conquer and enslave non-white peoples. The theology was visual, the art taught supremacy, and yet The truth refused to vanish entirely. In underground churches of Brazil, in secret shrines of the Caribbean, in the spirituals of enslaved Africans, the memory survived. They sang of Zion. They prayed for deliverance. They remembered a God who looked like them, even when every painting and icon insisted otherwise. Reclaiming the divine image is not about art. It's about identity. It's about looking into a mirror and seeing the face empire tried to erase. And today, cracks are showing in the whitewashed wall. The Black Madonna is being honored again. Ancient depictions are resurfacing. Scholars and believers alike are asking the question once forbidden. What if we were never outside the story? What if we were always at its center? That's the question we will answer in the final chapter, the moment where history, prophecy, and identity converge, where what was buried is resurrected. This isn't rage. This isn't rebellion. This is revelation. And more than that, this is resurrection. For centuries, the world told us, you are Gentiles. You are outsiders to the promise. You are not in the book. But page after page of this journey has whispered a different truth. From the Persian scrolls that described Israelites as dark-skinned children of Cush, to Solomon's own words, I am black and beautiful, to the faces painted in Ethiopian manuscripts, to the prophecies of Deuteronomy fulfilled in the slave ships of the Atlantic, to the Sabbath drums of Nigeria, the call and response worship in the Carolinas, the names of God carried in African tongues. The evidence has never said we were outside the story. It says we were at the center, buried under empire, perhaps forgotten by men, maybe, but never lost. Because the black identity in Scripture is not a theory, not a fringe idea, not an internet movement. It is fulfilled prophecy, and prophecy takes time to ripen. The Sabbath kept by Yoruba elders, that's not imitation, that's inheritance. The Igbo's reverence for Chukwu, the Most High, that's not conversion, that's continuity. The barefoot praise, the sacred rhythm, the clapping hands in black churches, that's not mere culture, that's Levitical memory, still alive after centuries of exile. Even the names survived El Elyon, El Shaddai, Yahweh. They echo in African dialects, in lullabies, in prayers whispered under colonial rule. These are not new flames, they are embers that never went out. Isaiah 11:11-12 says, In that day the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the remnant of his people from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. Cush, the islands, across the seas, scattered through slavery, renamed by empire, cut off from their history, yet promised a gathering. We were never merely Africans. We are descendants of covenant. We are carriers of prophecy. We are the firstborn who were scattered now being called home. And here's the beauty, what we see today is not rebellion against religion. It is a return to the root, the resurgence of Hebrew names, the keeping of the Sabbath, the rejection of idols, the rediscovery of ancient laws. It's not about starting something new, it's about finishing something old. Look around. In Jamaica, young men trade Sunday worship for Saturday rest. In Chicago, grandmothers are calling God Yah again. In Lagos, teenagers are blowing the shofar from rooftops. In Harlem, elders recite Torah from memory. In Ethiopia, ancient scrolls are read aloud in Ge'ez and Hebrew. No government mandated this. No denomination ordered it. It's not the work of politics. It's the spark of memory touching dry bones. Because what's buried in the soul can't be erased by history. For 400 years, we were told we were cursed. For 400 years, we were told we were property. For 400 years, we were taught to see God's face as foreign. But prophecy never said we were forgotten. It said we were sealed, and now the seal is breaking. This is not about hating anyone else. It's about loving the truth enough to let it set us free, even when it terrifies systems built on lies. And so this word turns to you, the elders, the quiet keepers of the covenant. While the world shifted, you stood still. While images changed, you remembered his true face. You prayed through exile. You kept the Sabbath in secret. You sang Yahweh's name when it was forbidden. Your obedience in silence is the bridge to this awakening. You are not a footnote. You are the foundation. Now, your grandchildren are not just looking for facts. They are looking for something unshakable, and that is you. Because what survives in silence is what God will honor openly. And the awakening we are living right now is not built on trends. It's built on the memory you refuse to lose. This is not rebellion, it's resurrection. And the prophecy is unfolding before our eyes.